Part 6 of this series showed you service contracts interfaces like ProductRepositoryInterface that define what a module can do. Here is the payoff. Send an HTTP post to /v1/products with a JSON body, and Magento creates a real product. No controller was written for that. No route file names a controller class at all. Instead, a small XML file maps the URL straight onto that same repository interface from Part 6, and a chain of framework classes does everything else, matching the path, checking your permissions, unpacking your JSON into typed PHP objects, and calling the service method directly. Today we trace that whole chain through the real files, every line from a real get checkout of the pin 2.4.9 tag. Welcome back to Magento Development Deep Dive. This part is about the Web API, the layer that turns Magento's service contracts into a REST API without a single handwritten controller. The question we are answering is concrete. When an HTTP request arrives at /rest/v1/products, what exactly happens between the web server handing Magento the request and product repository interface save method actually running? We will read the real route declarations, catalog ships, the real front controller, the real router and route matcher, the real permission check, and the real line of code that finally invokes the service, all with ground truth line numbers from a local checkout of the pin 2.4.9 tag. By the end of this part, 5 things should click. What a real route element inside catalog's webapi.xml file actually declares a URL pattern, an HTTP method, a service class and method, and an access control resource, nothing more. How the REST front controller's dispatch method stays tiny by delegating to a validator and a processor pool. How the configuration class and the router cooperate to find the one route a path belongs to. How the route object walks the URL part by part to pull a value like a product SKU out of a placeholder. And where permissions are enforced, plus the exact line of framework code that ends the chain by calling your service method. Strip away the code and every REST call crosses 5 stages. Declare, a module ships a webapi.xml file mapping a URL and an HTTP method onto a service class and method, pure declaration, the same pattern this series has seen for DI configuration, layout, and admin grids. Dispatch, the REST front controller receives the request, validates it, and picks a processor from a pool. Match, the router walks candidate routes until one matches the path, extracting any placeholder values along the way. Resolve, the InputParamsResolver turns the raw JSON body and URL parameters into the typed arguments the service method signature demands. And invoke, the synchronous processor makes one direct call into the service class, the same repository object any PHP code in Magento would use, and hands the result back to be serialized. A few things help before we dig in. Part 6, on service contracts, is the real foundation here. Every route we are about to read points at exactly the kind of repository interface that part covered. Part 3, on dependency injection, helps to the processor at the end of the chain retrieves the live service through the object manager, using the same preference resolution we traced back then. Some awareness of access control resources is useful, because every route names one and the framework enforces it on every request. And as always, either a real Magento 2.4.9 checkout or the GitHub tag open in a browser, so you can follow along in the real files. This is the real top of catalog's webapi.xml file. Each route element carries exactly 4 facts. A URL pattern /v1/products. An HTTP method post here. A service element naming an interface and a method product repository interface, save. And a resources block naming the access control resource a caller must hold Magento catalog products. That is the entire declaration for creating products over REST. Just below it, the get variant of /v1/products/:SKU maps onto the same interface's get method, and that :SKU placeholder is the part we will watch being extracted later. No controller class appears anywhere in this file, because none exists. Every REST request in Magento lands here first, the dispatch method of the webapi module's REST class, which implements the framework's front controller interface. And notice how little it does. It normalizes the path, removing the REST prefix and the store code. It asks a RequestValidator to validate the request that one call hides the routing and the permission check, and we will open it shortly. Then it asks a processor pool for the right processor and tells it to process the request. Everything else in this method is a try-catch that masks exceptions into safe HTTP error responses. The front controller is deliberately a thin dispatcher. The interesting work lives in the collaborators it delegates to. Before any matching happens, someone has to turn the parsed webapi.xml into route objects, that is this method, getRestRoutes, on the webapi module's REST configuration class. It reads the merged configuration for every module's webapi file, keyed by URL and then by HTTP method. And it starts with a fast path. If the request's path info is itself a key in that array, an exact match, like /v1/products with no placeholders, it builds a single route object directly, carrying the service class, the service method, and the access control resources straight out of the parsed.xml, and returns immediately. Only when there is no exact match does it fall through to scanning URL patterns whose placeholders might fit, which is where the router comes in. This is the entire router, 20 lines, one public method, one responsibility. It asks the configuration class we just read for the candidate routes, then walks them in order, asking each route object to match the request. A route that matches returns an array of extracted parameters, possibly empty, and the router immediately copies those parameters onto the request object, then keeps collecting. When the loop ends, it returns the last route that matched, which by the configuration sorting is the most specific one. And if nothing matched at all, it throws a web API exception carrying an HTTP 4.0 for the exact error you get when you typo an endpoint path. And here is the actual matching, on the route object itself. Both the incoming path and the route's own pattern are split into parts on slashes. Different part counts instant fail, return false. Then it walks the parts in parallel. Where the route pattern had a placeholder like :skew, the variables array remembers that position, and the incoming part is URL decoded and captured under that name. That is the exact moment a URL segment becomes the skew argument your repository method receives. Where the pattern had a literal, like products, the parts must simply be equal, or the whole match fails. No regular expressions, no compiled route table, just a part-by-part walk, which is why Web API route debugging in Magento is so tractable. Remember the single validate callback in dispatch? This is what it hides. First, the validator runs the router match we just traced, so routing actually happens inside validation, before any processor runs. Then, with the matched route in hand, it makes 3 checks. Check permissions asks the authorization service whether the current consumer, an admin token, an integration, a customer token, or an anonymous caller is allowed the access control resources that route declared back in webapi.xml, and throws an authorization exception if not. Only HTTPS rejects routes marked secure when the request came over plain HTTP. And check back pressure applies request throttling if it is configured. The resource ref you write in webapi.xml is enforced right here, on every single request. Next problem, your JSON body is an array of strings, but ProductRepositoryInterface save demands a product interface object. The InputParamsResolver owns that gap. Its resolve method runs the RequestValidator from the previous step, grabs the matched route, and applies the route's input array size limit, a denial of service guard on payload size. Then it hands 3 things to the service input processor: the service class, the service method, and the merged input data body plus the URL parameters the router extracted. The processor reflects on the method's signature, reads the parameter types, and builds real-typed objects out of your JSON, recursively. That is why API payload keys mirror getter names on the data interfaces from Part 6. Reflection is doing the mapping. And here the chain ends. The synchronous request processor, the one the processor pool picks for ordinary REST calls, resolves the input parameters, reads the service class and method off the route, and asks the object manager to get the service. Get, not create, so the interface resolves through the same DI preference from Part 3, to the exact same shared repository instance the rest of Magento uses. Then the line everything has been building toward, call user_func array on the service and method, with the typed parameters. Your webapi.xml declaration just became a plain PHP method call. The return value goes through the service output processor, which walks the data interface's getters to build the JSON response, the reverse of what the input processor did on the way in. A few things trip people up here. Routing runs inside the RequestValidator's validate method, not in a separate routing phase, so when an endpoint 404s, the exception originates in what looks like a validation step, which surprises people reading stack traces. Anonymous callers only pass routes whose resource ref is literally the word anonymous. Catalog ships exactly 1, the product's render info endpoint near the bottom of its webapi.xml file. Route matching splits on slashes before URL decoding each part, so a skew containing an encoded slash changes the part count and the route silently stops matching, a classic invisible 404. And because the processor fetches the service with object manager get, your DI preference decides which concrete class answers the API call. Swap the preference for ProductRepositoryInterface, and your class is now your store's REST API, for better or worse. Let's pull this back together. A webapi.xml file maps a URL pattern and an HTTP method onto a service class, a service method,
and an access control resource the entire public declaration, no controllers anywhere.
The REST front controller's dispatch method stays deliberately thin. Normalize the path, validate, hand off to a processor from the pool. The configuration class turns merged webapi.xml into route objects with an exact match fast path, and the router walks the candidates, keeping the most specific match or throwing a 404. The route object extracts placeholder values like the SKU part by part, and the RequestValidator enforces the route's declared permissions on every call. And the synchronous processor finishes the job-typed parameters from the InputParamsResolver, the service from the object manager, one call userfunc array, and the response serialized back out. That's the real machinery behind Magento's REST API, straight from a Git checkout of the pin 2.4.9 source, every file and line verified against that exact commit. Part 15 stays on the API layer but switches languages GraphQL, with its schema files, resolvers, and a very different query pipeline that still ends at the same service contracts. If you want the rest of this series as it publishes, subscribe now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 15.